Welcome, Green Spring. Today is January 6, 2016. I'm Fran Duval, your host for today, and happy to again be here for our quarterly report on a president and a presidential library with Len Kalkworth, our expert on presidential libraries. Hello, Len.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay. Ready to go.
Yes, indeed. Well, we're going to talk about a president today that is who's very well known. I think in many cases, those of us here at Green Spring, he was the president during the days of our youth, so many of us remember him very well. There were two Roosevelts, or Roosevelt as he's sometimes pronounced. The first one was Teddy Roosevelt. He was the 28th president, and of course related to FDR. They were, I think, about the fifth cousins. The Roosevelt, by the way, the word Roosevelt, a Dutch word, means Valley of the Roses. So they were divided into two families, really. The one family was in Long Island, Teddy Roosevelt. They were Republicans since the days of the Civil War. The family in upstate New York, Hyde Park, was primarily, loosely, I guess, a Democratic party, a Democratic family. FDR became president, but he didn't become president easily. He had to work a little harder at it than Teddy Roosevelt did, for example. He was a real achiever. He was not one who was strong in particular ideology. He was a very practical person. He accomplished a lot. He was the first one to break the tradition that George Washington established, that a president would only serve for 2 consecutive terms. Of course, he went on not only the 3rd term, but eventually the 4th term, which we'll mention later on. First of all, FDR was born in Hyde Park. That was his home the entire life. He did not go to school until he was 15 years of age. Then he went to Groton, Connecticut, same place where Teddy Roosevelt had gone. He was neither Roosevelt, Teddy or FDR was a real achiever academically. In fact, there are those who said that they wonder whether or not they would have been able to get back into Harvard today, for example. So. Both fathers died in the first year of each one being at Harvard, which is kind of interesting. But when FDR's father died, his mother, and by the way, he was the only child, his mother, Sarah, moved to be right near Harvard so that she could kind of dot over him. She was a very domineering mother, as you well know. Both Teddy Roosevelt and FDR became state senators, and FDR became a state senator at the age of 28. And after that, he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same position that his cousin Teddy Roosevelt had held at one time. But FDR really was not very enamored with Woodrow Wilson, and that's kind of an interesting thing, being of the same political party. FDR had a little problem while he was Secretary of the Navy. There was a homosexual scandal at in Rhode Island, Newport News, and not that FDR was involved in it, but he tried to cover it up, and it was a real political mistake. Both Teddy and FDR tried to become an officer. Both of them were turned down for an officer's commission. When FDR was at Harvard, Teddy was a candidate for the presidency, and he had no problem at all supporting him, even though FDR was a Democrat. But when later on, when Teddy became trying to bolt the party and became part of the Bull Moose Party, FDR would no longer support him at that point. The very important thing about FDR was his marriage to Eleanor. First of all, they were related, they were distant cousins, They came from the same social background. They were from the Knickerbocker family in New York City. Not that they were extremely wealthy, but they were well-to-do, and they spent their time only within that particular social circle, by the way. Now, Eleanor, for example, was a very quiet person. She had a difficult upbringing. She was the daughter of Teddy Roosevelt's younger brother, who happened to be an alcoholic. He died at a very early age. Eleanor's mother was a very pretty woman, but a very petty woman, a very harsh disciplinarian, and Eleanor did not like her at all. Eleanor, probably the saving grace for her was that she went to London, or went to a school about 17 miles outside of London, and there the headmistress was a very free thinker. She was an atheist. Apparently this really helped Eleanor to become quite a person in her own right. Teddy's daughter, Alice, who has such a sharp tongue, had some very terrible things to say about Eleanor, and she called her a very dull person, a dull little do-gooder, had very little respect for her apparently, but in any event, she became quite a person as a result of her time outside of London. Now, when FDR and Eleanor became engaged, they kept it secret, even kept it from Sarah, FDR's mother, because she did not want anybody to take over her son. In fact, she did everything in her power to make it possible that they wouldn't break up. And she took him on a cruise and so on and separated them as much as possible. Then she even engaged the president, Teddy Roosevelt, to try to break it up. And he liked Franklin, so that he would not do that. So eventually they got married, and Teddy Roosevelt was even present at the marriage as well, at the ceremony, which took place in New York City. All along during the marriage, Sarah, the mother, was very domineering. Probably Eleanor allowed it to happen because she was so retiring. For example, during the whole time in Hyde Park, whenever they had meals together, FDR would sit on one end of the table, his mother was on the other end of the table, and Eleanor would sit on one side of the table. As far as the bedrooms were concerned, FDR had a beautiful bedroom overlooking the Hudson, a large one. On the other end, not quite as beautiful, but also a large bedroom was Sarah. In between was a small bedroom that became that of Eleanor. So Eleanor kind of...
Let me interrupt a minute. Did they let visitors go up into those rooms?
Yes, yeah.
At
Any
Park?
place now at this particular point, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
all right.
At Hyde Park now.
Yeah.
This is all part of the library and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes. This is where one of the reasons, I guess, that Sarah was so dominant and FDR was not one to try to make waves. Also because Sarah was the one that controlled the purse strings, so that made a difference, obviously. Eleanor really experienced her freedom when FDR got his position in D.C. Then she really came into her own. In some ways, she was kind of a one-person USO because this is during World War I.
Right.
Whenever the troops would come through Union Station, she would be there to greet the troops. And so she took on some new responsibilities.
And that was when he was Under Secretary of the Navy.
That's right, during that particular time, yeah.
Now Sarah didn't come to Washington with them.
No, fortunately.
That's
fortunately
why she,
for her,
that's
sure.
why
That's why she had all this freedom.
Right.
Now, also at this particular point, Eleanor, with the children, spent a lot of time at Campobello, which is their summer home. And one of the reasons that she went there was because of the polio epidemic. And they felt that they might get polio, the children would get polio from crowds, and so she was trying to avoid them being in crowds. And the irony is that this is where FDR got his polio attack. During this time, while she spent this time up at their summer place, FDR became infatuated with her secretary, Lucy Mercer. There are two individuals who really had a big influence in FDR's administration. One was Lewis Howe. He was kind of the political person, and he was kind of threw himself at FDR. He knew that he himself could not become a great political person, could not be elected, and so he tried to advise FDR.
It was a kingmaker.
Yes, but Sarah and Eleanor did not like him at all. FDR did. Eventually, he kind of won Eleanor over. The other one that was a very important person in FDR's life was Henry Hopkins, who was more involved during the war, but he also was a very influential person. Now, prior to going to getting polio, for example, FDR was, had been a state senator and had been in Washington. He was then tapped to become a vice presidential candidate on the ticket with Cox from Ohio. They lost very badly, by the way, but it did a couple of things. One of the things it did, it gave FDR a national exposure, and so he did a lot of campaigning at that point. After they lost, FDR became a vice president of a bonding company in New York City. Now, the following August, after they had been defeated, this is when he was stricken with polio. And the next 35 months or so, he worked very hard to overcome this handicap. And many say that it was because of his sheer determination that he ever was able to do what he was able to do. Now, of course, he never was able to walk on his own again. And I think many of us didn't know about this because the newspapers didn't mention it. You saw no pictures of it. But he spent his time at Warm Springs, Georgia, at the mineral spa there. He was able to stand up almost by himself because of the water, the buoyancy of the water. And later on, by the way, he bought Warm Springs and made it a going concern. But after about 35 months, they tapped him to give the nominating speech for the next Democratic candidate, which was Alfred Smith, who had been governor of New York. And why the Democratic Party ever selected him, I have no idea, because he
Selected who?
Smith.
Smith, oh,
yeah.
okay.
But FDR gave the nominating speech, but Smith didn't have a ghost of a chance when you think of it, because first of all, he was a Roman Catholic, and that was impossible in those days to be elected. They said that he dressed like a city slicker from New York City, and this went contrary to so many people, and certainly against the blue-collar people and the farmers. They would never have voted for him. So he really lost heavily.
Before he began, he lost.
Yeah, he really did. Well, when the time came for the election, he really lost. But it did something. It gave Roosevelt the opportunity to get national exposure again, and for people to see that he was physically would be able to do so, even though he went to the podium on the arms of his son, as you probably remember, and he made the nominating speech. So he The other thing that he did, it created a vacancy in the governorship in New York State, and of course, who was elected but FDR to become the governor. The next 4 years during that time, he really was not much happened during that time. He was kind of a governor in waiting to become the president of the United States. Now, prior to becoming elected, apparently Roosevelt already was thinking in terms of becoming president, and part of his brain trust, the people that he gathered around him to advise him, one of them was a man whose name I think we ought to remember. His name is Rexford G. Tugwell, and he was a professor at Columbia. He was an agricultural specialist, but he had served with Herbert Hoover under Herbert Hoover's administration. And he's the one that I remember reading about said all of the programs that FDR proposed was already being considered by Herbert Hoover, but he's the one that made that comment, and I thought that was interesting. Well, when the time came for the next Democratic convention in Chicago, they nominated FDR, and he broke tradition. He broke a lot of traditions, but the one tradition he broke now that he flew to Chicago because prior to that, a candidate was never present at the convention. And so that also showed that he was physically able to do so. And Hoover's reputation was so negative that there was no problem at all about Roosevelt being elected on the next election. There was no love for Hoover at all at that point, but now after he was nominated and prior to him being inaugurated, which was later, that was in March in those days, I guess it was in Florida, there was an assassination attempt on FDR's life, and they did not strike him, but they struck the mayor of Chicago, who took the bullet and died from it. And the assassin was later electrocuted in the electric chair. Now, what made things change so beautifully after the election was not so much what had happened, but FDR's positive attitude. His fireside chat, for example, just the way he conducted himself on that cigarette that he always had on the long stem.
With the holder.
Yeah, the holder. Made people think, oh, things will be all right. And then he said, of course, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And then right after he took over, he declared a bank holiday. Prior to that, as banks closed, people would lose all of their savings. And when the banks opened again, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation had been established, and I forget the amount, but if you had like $30,000 or $40,000 in the bank, that was guaranteed. If the bank closed, the insurance company would then reimburse you. So the day after his fireside chat, instead of people withdrawing their money from the bank, they started going back and depositing money again. And that was a turnaround. And there was such a flurry of activity the first 100 days. And the interesting thing, and this is almost impossible to believe now, but every bill that they proposed was passed in the first 100 days. And there was one bill that had to do with the banking, the bank bill. It was submitted. There was no printed copy of the bill. It passed both houses the same day and was on the desk of the president to be signed that night.
What was the makeup of the Congress then? Was it all Democrat?
No, it was not all Democrat, but it was.
Was it majority?
Majority was Democrat,
in both houses.
But
okay.
the Republicans went along with everything that was being proposed at that particular point. All right. Now, let me just mention a couple names because these probably will ring a bell with many of us. Garner was vice president. Cordell Hull from Tennessee was the Secretary of State. Frances Perkins, first woman cabinet member. And by the way, she was very well received, and I forget how many years she served, but a good number of years, and she was highly regarded by labor as well. So Henry Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture. His father had been Secretary of Agriculture under Harding and Coolidge, and then Harold Ickes, I guess that's how you pronounce it.
Ickes, I think.
Yeah, or Republican, was Secretary of Interior. Okay. Now, this was the day when all of these letters came into being, you know, the acronyms.
The acronyms,
yeah.
oh my, yeah. The WPA,
The WPA.
all of those,
the
yeah.
CC, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, the other thing that took place was the repeal of prohibition. And that wasn't necessarily because of moral reasons. When liquor could be sold legally, it could also be taxed. And that meant that there was income for the federal government, okay? One of the other projects was the PWA, Public Works Administration. And this included the building of the Triborough Bridge in New York City. It linked the Key West in Florida, the building of the Boulder Dam, which became known as the Hoover Dam, which Herbert Hoover had already planned, the modernization of the New York to the D.C. Railroad. And all of this was done with a very hostile press. Now, FDR did not have an easy time of it. And, but the interesting thing is that there was no indication of any kind of fraud or financial carelessness. Now, when it comes to the end of the first term, he runs his next term. He runs against Landon of Kansas, and now there are 48 states at this particular point, and only 2 states voted for Landon, the Republican, and that was Maine and Vermont. FDR carried the other 46 states, but none of the states that he carried that voted for him had newspaper support.
Interesting.
And 80% of the people of his own social class voted against FDR. He just did not have support there. He had support from the blue-collar workers and from the farmers, because that's the ones who had benefited so much from him.
Sure. All his programs were geared toward the economy and raising these people.
Right.
We have about 5 minutes, by the way.
All right. When he was sworn in 1937, it was a very gloomy swearing in, because the Chief Justice was Charles Evans Hughes, who was a very political person because he had been the GOP candidate against Woodrow Wilson before he was appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So, now, this is the beginning of Roosevelt's major political problems and mistakes, because 17 days after he was inaugurated, he suggested, or more than suggested, that the Supreme Court be enlarged from 9 members to, I think it was 11 members. Yeah. And he hadn't even cleared this with people of his own party, and the Democrats were very much opposed to it. He used as his excuse that the court ought to be enlarged to help clear the docket. They had too much to do. But it was blatantly political because of the, the 9 cases of the New Deal. 7 of them were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and so he wanted to pack the court to change it so that he could get these things through. It was a political error on his part, and a man who was so politically astute to make a mistake like this. If he had waited a bit, at least two of the Supreme Court justices would have retired anyway, or if they had not decreased the lifelong salary of the Supreme Court justices, they probably would have resigned before. So that was, then the next thing that was against him was the fact that the war was beginning to break in Europe. He also said, now this is a political mistake also, that he was going to get rid of some of the Democrats and worked very hard to defeat them at the next election. And many of them were defeated, but not the ones that he wanted to have defeated. So again, that did not help him. All right, let me just mention.
You need to move on.
Yeah, at the end of 1937, before his third term, the economy was really going downhill, and he was really in very serious trouble. Also, the kind of rumors that were taking place about him was so unfortunate. They were saying that he had been a lightweight at Harvard, that he wanted to be a dictator, that he was clinically insane. It also indicated that he had syphilis, and this was publicized in newspapers and believed by many respectable people. And the people in Europe were so shocked by this because they saw him as being the real hero.
A hero,
and
yeah.
now they saw this kind of thing.
Exactly.
And he's not the only one where this thing happened. So, well, I guess we're almost out of time. And
well, we have a little bit, but
I want to mention that he wanted to run. He wanted to run for the third term, but he had to, break tradition.
Right.
And had to do it in some kind of a practical way of indicating that this was absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
And he did get that popular support and ran against Wendell Willkie, who regarded him as being a warmonger. And Roosevelt made it very clear that they would not get involved in a European war unless the United States were attacked. And of course that happened with Pearl Harbor. Then he goes on to a fourth term, and we don't have time for that, to talk about that, but that's when he died, of course, during the beginning of the fourth term. If he had changed his vice presidency, Henry Wallace was the vice president during the third term, and if he had died just a bit earlier, Henry Wallace would have been the president rather than Harry Truman. Yeah, so.
Well, I wonder then, I think Truman was such a fine president, and
and Wallace was not accepted by the Democratic Party.
He was not?
No, he was. I think he was too liberal for many of them.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
well, Truman had that combination.
Yeah.
Well, with the president with this many terms, we could hardly get it all done in 28 minutes,
Right.
but you did your damnedest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Len, very much, and we'll follow all this up in 3 months with somebody else.
Yeah, probably Harry Truman.
I suppose it'll be
Yeah.
Harry Truman.